Hello, everybody. This is our first lecture on the 60s, and this lecture is about the Civil Rights Movement. So in the 60s, we'll talk about the Civil Rights Movement. We'll also talk about the Vietnam War, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the countercultural movement that develops later in the 60s. All three of these things will have a big influence on American society and culture in the future decades. Okay, so here we are, civil rights. It's important for me to note right up front that the civil rights movement was not a movement led by whites. This is a movement that consisted and was led by Black Americans who were just tired of waiting for change. So think about what was happening before the 1960s. Racial segregation in the South, also disfranchisement of Blacks in the South. We've talked about this. So what the Civil Rights Movement sought to do was to abolish racial discrimination in the South by ending racial segregation and by ending the disfranchisement of Blacks in the South. All right, and you remember some of those racial segregation laws. These are those Jim Crow laws that were enforced by southern states that were allowed to do this by the Supreme Court, by this Plessy versus Ferguson court case held in 1896 that upheld racial segregation. So ever since then, southern states have passed laws that separated the minority of Black Southerners from the white majority. And then also you remember how the disfranchisement of Blacks occurred. We've talked about this through literacy tests, through poll taxes, through the grandfather clause that was passed by southern states. And all of this meant the loss of political rights and the loss of a political voice for Southern Blacks. Now, there were some roots of the Civil Rights Movement that I want you to be familiar with. Even though it began in earnest around 1960, the movement had these roots that went way back to, number one, the Reconstruction era. We didn't talk much about the Reconstruction era, but remember this was a time that followed the Civil War. And what the civil rights movement of the 1960s was doing was just trying to finish the work that had begun in the Reconstruction era. So what kind of work was begun in the Reconstruction era? You remember these amendments. We've talked about these amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th ended slavery. The 14th brought U.S. citizenship to former slaves, and then the 15th gave some of those former slaves the right to vote. So all three of these were passed during Reconstruction, and as a society, America had not followed through and ensured that these amendments were actually carried out. So the Civil Rights Movement wants to do that. It wants to finish the work that these amendments started and carry these out. All right, the second root that I want you to be familiar with is the racial system destabilization caused by those two world wars. In other words, those two world wars destabilized the American racial system. So how did this happen? In World War I, lots of Black soldiers fought. They went to Europe. They were stationed in places like France, and they realized that the French people didn't treat them any differently than it did anyone else. They weren't treated, in other words, in France like they were in the South. There was no segregation, there was no discrimination. And so when these Black American soldiers came home after World War I, they decided they kind of liked being treated the way they were in France, and they expected the United States to, after this war was over, to treat them better. It didn't happen, and so they were upset at that. World War II, think about who we were fighting in World War II. We were fighting, at least in part, we were fighting Adolf Hitler and his Nazi regime, and one of their philosophies was that they were, well, it was just a philosophy based on racism, particularly against the Jews. So racism during and after World War II really fell out of favor with Americans. But here we were still in the United States, particularly in the South, still basically living in heavily racist society. And so because of who we fought in World War II, this helped to destabilize our racial system. People started thinking twice about it and questioning the lack of full citizenship status of particularly Southern blacks. The third route, let me show you this. This is an interesting graph. Actually, this goes with the third route. There it is. The migration of Southern blacks to the North. So again, these are roots of the civil rights movement. These are things that led to the civil rights movement. And the migration of Southern blacks out of the South led to that. We've already mentioned the Great Migration, which began during World War I and continued after World War I. This is where a lot of Southern blacks began to move out of the South really for the first time, many of them to northern cities like Detroit, wanting to work in Henry Ford's automobile factories, others to New York City. This is how the Harlem Renaissance began. Well, during and after World War II, there was another great migration. Historians call this the Second Great Migration. Even more blacks moved out of the South. We could date this Second Great Migration from 1940 to about 1970. And so this brings us to this really interesting graph. So what this graph shows is the percentage of the African American population living in the American South. So you can see beginning in 1790, over 90% of all Black Americans lived in the South. And this really didn't start to change much until you see 1910 there. And this was that Great Migration beginning. Well, that Great Migration continued until about 1930, and you can see that decade from 1930 to 1940, it pretty much stabilized. And then beginning in 1940, you can see the percentage of blacks remaining in the South starting to go down. In other words, a lot of blacks in the South were moving out of the South. And again, they're moving north. They're also moving to California, Los Angeles in particular, because there are great manufacturing jobs there. And so you can see by 2010, about 57% of all African Americans today, roughly, or a few years ago, are living in the South. And so they're living all over the nation. And this was, again, the second Great Migration. And this is one of the root causes of the civil rights movement. The fourth root is there was an emphasis during the Cold War, the beginning of the Cold War in particular, before 1960. There's an emphasis on freedom. There's an emphasis on freedom. When we think about President Truman and the Truman Doctrine, which we will discuss in class on Tuesday, it'll be one of our class discussions. But again, let me just remind you, this was because I mentioned it a few minutes ago. What the Truman Doctrine said was that we in the United States will contain communism. Now, why were we going to do that? One of the reasons that President Truman emphasized during a speech about the Truman Doctrine was that we are the society, we Americans are the society that values freedom. He said in that speech, he said, the American way of life is based upon free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, and freedom from political oppression. Of course, this is great rhetoric, but a lot of Black Americans were saying this is not our experience at all. And so there's a big gulf, a big distance between America's rhetoric of freedom during the Cold War and the practice of freedom, particularly in the South, which was quite embarrassing to us as a nation, because we've got, again, Jim Crow laws in the South and disfranchisement laws in the South. And so we could certainly debate the extent of freedom, but it's certainly limited for Black Americans in the South. All right. Well, we need some kind of spark for the civil rights movement, and this spark occurs in 1954 with, you guessed it, a Supreme Court ruling. And that ruling was Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. What this ruling did was it overturned that Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember that court case in 1896 that said it's okay for Southern states, or any state for that matter, to separate one group of people from the other, as long as that separation, those facilities are equal. There can be separate facilities, but they must be equal. In Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court said that no, separate but equal is not constitutional. In fact, it's unconstitutional, particularly racial segregation in public schools. And that's what this court case was all about. It was about desegregating schools. And it declared the principle of separate but equal in education unconstitutional. All right. So when it did this in 1954, there was a problem. Well, there's maybe an opportunity is a better way to look at it, and that was that it didn't give a timeline on how quickly or how slowly American schools should be desegregated. What it did say, though, was that it should happen with all deliberate speed. Now, this could be interpreted, and here's the problem. This could be interpreted many different ways, and it was interpreted many different ways, particularly by Southern states. Some were very slow in desegregating their schools. But it did do a couple of things. It did inspire optimism that discrimination might soon disappear. And it also meant that the federal courts might be able to help with ending segregation. All right, so this is the spark. The activist phase of the civil rights movement actually occurred the very next year. It occurred in Montgomery with the Montgomery Bus Boycott. This was begun by Rosa Parks, who is a Black seamstress. She got on a bus, she sat down, and she refused to give up her seat to a white man. She was required to do that by a city ordinance that said that Blacks must give up their seats to whites when asked. She was arrested as a result of that. And as a result of her arrest, then the Black community in Montgomery boycotted the buses. So this was the Montgomery Bus Boycott, lasted about a year. And this is, again, the beginning of the activist phase of the civil rights movement. The boycott ended, you can see there, in 1956 when a federal district court ruled that Alabama's social segregation laws were unconstitutional. At least those social segregation laws on buses were unconstitutional. And so this was a victory for the Black community in Montgomery. This boycott, again, was a success. And this was the beginning of the civil rights movement. It began as a nonviolent crusade based in Southern Black churches. Northern liberals, mostly white liberals, joined in. And this movement's symbolic head was this man right here, Martin Luther King Jr. He had recently moved to Montgomery. He was 26 years old when the boycott started, and he was a minister, and he was the son of a minister. And he used the language of freedom often in his speeches. At one point, at the beginning of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, he said, "We, the disinherited of this land, are reaching out for the daybreak of freedom and justice and equality." So there's an example of him using freedom as well as some other really heavyweight words like justice and equality. Now, this language and these words would pervade his speeches, and it would pervade the movement itself. And this brings us to his philosophy. So a quick outline of Martin Luther King's philosophy of struggle says that he said that evil must be met with good. Evil must be met with good, and hate must be met with Christian love. Again, he's a Christian minister, so the language of the Christian Bible will be used quite a bit by him. Violence, he said, must be met with peaceful demands for change. Now, this is obviously a non-violent approach. It's also an approach that doesn't mind being disobedient to certain laws. So there's some civil disobedience that will be used by King and others in the movement. So when you put nonviolence with civil disobedience, you've got a very potent weapon. For this to be successful, the other side, the side that you're trying to change, they've got to have some kind of a conscience, which would probably mean that if Hitler and the Nazi Party were on the other side of this, and the civil rights movement was trying to change their minds about how society was structured, that probably wouldn't work, because it's hard to think of them having much of a conscience. So the opposing side must have a conscience for nonviolence and civil disobedience to work. Now, let me tell you about three organizations of the civil rights movement, three big organizations. The first one I'll mention is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. This was a group of Black ministers and civil rights activists formed by King himself. He was one of the leaders. And what the SCLC did was it implemented King's nonviolent approach. All right, another group was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, often called SNCC, SNCC. So this was a group of, as the name suggests, college students. These are Black college students who organized, and they coordinated what were known as sit-ins. Sit-ins were where typically members of SNCC would go into, say, a place where it was not allowed for Blacks to be, and they would go in and just civilly disobey the policies of the company or the laws of a town. For example, in Greensboro, North Carolina, there was a sit-in at a drugstore that the drugstore had a policy of not serving food to Black patrons. So 4 Black students, local college students, went in there one morning and they sat at the lunch counter. They ordered food. They were denied their order, and they just sat there all day. They came back the next morning, did the same thing, and they did this for several weeks. And this was a sit-in. They just continued to do this. It's a peaceful protest, trying to get the other side to change their policies. Eventually, that drugstore did change their policies. So these sit-ins were successful. I'm not ready for that. And then the third group I'll mention, the third organization, was the Congress of Racial Equity, CORE. What CORE did was it looked for confrontation, nonviolent confrontation. Actually, all 3 of these organizations looked for confrontation, but CORE seemed to look for it more. CORE had been around for several decades. It was begun in 1942, but in 1961, it launched what was known as the Freedom Rides. And again, this is an effort to look for confrontation with the other side, those who their CORE members are trying to convince to change their mind about how things are being done. Now, let me tell you something about these freedom rides. So it began in 61. A year before, in 1960, the Supreme Court had ruled that public buses could not be segregated. It was, in other words, unconstitutional for public buses to be segregated. These are buses that cross state lines. The problem is compliance was not being enforced. So CORE wanted to bring attention to that to the fact that compliance with this Supreme Court ruling was not being enforced. So these freedom rides were designed to test that compliance with the new court order. Um, what happened during these freedom rides were, in the North, black bus riders, as well as some northern liberal bus riders, got on the bus and they rode down to the South. And what they were trying to, once the bus ended up at a place like Birmingham, when those riders got off, they would usually be met by two different waiting rooms, one for black and one for white. And so what they did, they got on the bus in the North, they got down to places like Birmingham, and they ignored the black waiting rooms, and they went into the white waiting rooms. What they're trying to do is bring attention again to the fact that these waiting rooms were not integrated. They were often confronted by violent mobs. Here's one in Birmingham. This is a very interesting photograph. You see a group of white men there beating. It's hard to tell if this is a white freedom rider or a black freedom rider, but they are they have kind of gotten out of control there. And so these freedom riders were actually trying to bring about these kinds of confrontations, because the thinking was, if these confrontations are caught on film, are caught on video, and they're shown to the world, then the world will see exactly how the Deep South is, and they'll see that they're not complying with the laws. And so that was the point of doing this. These freedom rides, by the way, were a success. After incidents like this were caught on film, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, ordered and enforced bus terminals, as well as the buses themselves, to be desegregated later in 1961.